Hi, it's Dr. Saira. I am in a new setup. I did an office refresh last weekend and kind of redesigned my space to make it more recording friendly, more teaching friendly, and just kind of upgrade my space. It's been a couple of few years now that I've been kind of back and forth between a home office and office, and often my home office feels like this cobbled together thing, but that's where I do the recordings for these videos. And so I thought, okay, time to have a studio. So you'll see the mic, high-tech stuff, and so this is it. So I'm going to test this out. I'd love to know what you think about it in the comments about the new setup, and let's get into this week's chat. So I wanted to talk to you today about another adaptation. So what is an adaptation? It's a coping mechanism, right? It's something that we develop when we're kids so that we can deal with the ups and downs of just being alive in this three-dimensional reality, and where things can be dangerous, and we have to make sure that our caregivers are really close by and really accessible, and we do all these twists and turns to make that happen. So when we're really little, we develop these strategies. I like the word adaptations, and that's something that we use in our expansion project community because it reminds us that it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not a problem that we do these behaviors. It's just something that we've learned to manage through our day-to-day. And now that we're adults and we have agency, we can make different choices. And so one of the adaptations, so we've talked about a couple so far in the last couple of videos. We talked about people pleasing and compliance. And we talked about, there was another one. I can't remember what it is. It'll come back to me probably in the middle of the night. But there was a couple that we talked about. And this, controlling, of course I forget the controlling behaviors. So we talked about controlling behaviors as well. And the one I want to talk to you today about is emotional suppression and numbing. And this is one that's particularly fascinating to me because I have like the opposite of that. I like feel all the feels all the time. And so that's not an adaptation that I developed, but it's one that I see a lot in people I work with. A lot of people, when they're first starting this self-exploration journey, they get curious about like, what am I even feeling about this? And emotions are actually a really important indicator because they let us know whether we're in alignment or out of alignment. And so it's important that we have access to our emotions. It's a really, really important thing. When we cut ourselves off from our emotions, we lose the capacity to, it's like, people talk about the gut feeling. Well, if you can't feel your gut, then how will you know what your gut feelings are, right? So knowing, experiencing our emotions and having access to emotions is super important. Now, our emotions running the show, that can also be problematic. And so with emotional suppression and numbing, it's like we don't even know we have emotions or we push our feelings down. And there's some skills, like there's some silver lining in that adaptation. So for example, you might get really good at taking a pause between experiencing an emotion and expressing it, right? So you might get good at have an experience of an emotion, but you might not blast it out at someone because you've kind of got good at distancing yourself a little bit from your emotions. You might be a really resilient person, right? That you can take a lot and it can pile up and you're okay. You can hold it. The problem is if we don't acknowledge emotion, if we don't actually allow ourselves to process them, these energies that are coming through, because it's an energetic thing that happens in the body. There's a hormonal component, right? There's a physiological component to emotion. And if we don't allow that process to happen, it gets stuck in the body. And it can often turn into aches and pains and physical symptoms. And Dr. Gabor Mate talks about some of the physical symptoms of unexpressed emotion, and what that can show up, how that can show up in the body. So we do want to have room to feel the fullness of our emotions without letting our emotions run the show. So when we go at one extreme is that emotional suppression and numbing. At the other extreme is like the chaos, right? The constantly being overwhelmed by emotions and never just not being able to regulate your emotions at all. And those are the extremes. And somewhere in the middle is this idea of emotional awareness and mastery. right? Emotional awareness and mastery, where you can become aware of what you're feeling and you can navigate, you can kind of ride the waves of your emotions where they're not flooding you and taking you out, but they're not also like totally foreign and disconnected from you. One of the challenges with people who have that emotional suppression and numbing is that you can become a bit insensitive to other people's emotions, right? And so you might not be able to read the room when people are having an emotional expression, or you may have judgment about people who express their emotion, right? You might see them as weak, or you might see them as childish. You might have various judgments, and that comes from, see, what we do is we create these behaviors, like we create these ways of coping in the world, these adaptations. We don't create them, actually. We build them up, right? And then when other people do it different than us, then we judge them for being wrong. That's what we do. Like, well, your coping mechanisms don't match my coping mechanisms, and I'm right and you're wrong and you're doing it wrong. So if one of yours is emotional numbing and suppression, when you see other people who have a different way of moving through the world, where they're actually in touch with their emotions, or even they might even be on the extreme of the flooding, you might have a lot of judgment about any sort of emotional expression or emotional awareness at all, which also can be problematic, because remember, the goal is that balance point in the middle, right? Where we're not overwhelmed and mired and totally tossed about by our emotions and totally controlled by our emotions. We're also not totally tuned out and checked out from our own body responses of what's happening for us. Some emotional responses can be programmed, right, from a very young age. So they might be a response that doesn't actually match what's happening in the environment. So if you're someone who has that emotional suppression and numbing, and that's kind of been your adaptation, that's the way that you've coped in the world until now, but you're ready to change that, you're ready to get more in tune with your emotions, to become more aware, to start building up to that emotional mastery, well, you're going to have to face what's there. And for many people, it can be really uncomfortable when they first start getting a hold of the experience of an emotion, right? It can go from, like, if you're going from not feeling anything to starting to feel something, then that something can feel a bit uncomfortable. And we talked this morning in our community about how some of the early emotions may feel very charged. Like you might have anger, or you might have rage, or you might have like some sort of like big emotion that comes through. So it's like we feel nothing. And then one day you just pop. It's like, whoa, where did that come from? It's like the emotion is like making itself known. And then there's a bit of navigating that, right? There's a little bit of unpacking that. And honestly, we could spend decades, and people do, spend decades just dissecting an emotion, what it means, where it comes from, what to do about it. We can just kind of dissect. But that's actually not emotional mastery, right? What emotional mastery is allowing the emotion to come up and allowing it to come all the way through and out. So did you know that the physiological experience of an emotion in the body only lasts between 60 to 90 seconds unless you add thoughts to it? I'm going to say that again. The physiological experience of an emotion only lasts in the body 60 to 90 seconds unless you add thoughts to it. So when the feeling is coming up, if you can just allow it to come up and come all the way through and not attach thought and not try to fix it or understand it or stop it, but just allow it all the way through, well, then it'll transform. And this is almost magical when I walk people through this process, like when we do group work and we have people kind of tune into what's there and become present with that. And when they do, and then it changes, like just the act of becoming present to an emotion will shift that. And people are like, how did that happen? Like all I did was pay attention to it. Yeah, that's all you have to do. The amount of psychic and psychological energy it takes to push down an emotion, like it's exhausting to have to push down an emotion. And you're not just pushing down today's emotions, we're also pushing down like decades of emotions that haven't had a chance to be expressed. So when you first start getting opening to emotion, you might find like there's this flood and it's like, holy, where's this coming from? Well, it's from a lifetime of not actually feeling those feelings. And it doesn't have to be, I actually have For those who are kind of coming out of emotional numbing and suppression into feeling your feelings, you might have to institute some parameters around how to manage those feelings. So one of the things I often talk about, and this is not therapy, this is not therapeutic advice, it's just a tool that some people use and find beneficial, is the crying shower. Okay, the crying shower or the crying bath. I actually learned this from Oprah. She talked about it like back in the 90s. She talked about a crying bath. And so you run a bath, a nice warm bath, at the temperature that you like, and then you give yourself permission to emote, to allow the emotions to come up. So that might be crying, that might be for me it's crying, so I'm just going to use that. So for Oprah, she talked about crying. So you give yourself room to cry in the bath, and the tears just come and come and come. And when the water gets cold, you're done, and you get out, and you dry off, and you say, my next round is coming in my next bath. And that's a good way to manage if you're like going through a grieving period and you need to function and get through the day. Like you need to go to your work and you need to be in front of people and you need to do things, and you don't have maybe 3 weeks to just take off and be alone not be alone, but be supported in your grief. If you need to kind of make space for it, that's a really good way to make space, a crying bath. Or I use shower because I'm not a fan of baths. So, you start your shower and you let yourself cry in the shower until the water's cold, and then you're done. Now, if you live in an apartment building where your water's warm for 2 hours, this activity doesn't work for you. Okay, so it has to be where it's going to get cold and there's going to be an end point, so you can give yourself that space. And that's an activity that some people can find really helpful as they're starting to feel emotions and they're feeling like there's so much emotion and it's just taking over, right? And it's like spilling into every area of their life. Well, then give it some parameters. Put some parameters around it, right? Because the key here is that your emotions are not your true self. Your emotions are a function of this human vessel that you're in, but it's not your true self. They can be an indicator of whether you're in alignment or out of alignment, but we want to kind of learn to look after our emotions so that they're not taking us over and they're also not stunting us because we haven't been brave enough to feel them. So those are my thoughts on emotional numbing and suppression. Hopefully there's some ideas in there that you can find useful and helpful. Feel free to pass this video on and leave me a comment about how you manage and navigate emotions. Are you somebody who gets kind of lost and overwhelmed and mired, or are you someone who's kind of like stuck and can't really access your emotions or somewhere in between? And if you are somewhere in between, how did you get there? How did you get to that in-between point? Love to hear your resources and the tools that have helped you. And we'll see you next time. Hope you enjoyed that. Bye.